Today, I'm very excited to welcome a friend and someone that I have admired for a very long time, Professor Rob Brooks, who is at University of New South Wales in Sydney. Hi, Rob.
Hey, Amanda. Good to see
Hey.
you.
I'd like to start today by asking you a little bit about what you do as a scientist and how it might relate in whatever way to our current edition's theme of capitalism.
Good question. So I study behavioral biology. And for much of my career, the early part of my career, I studied that on very small animals where you can have, thousands of animals and do all sorts of interesting experiments, often insects. You can do all sorts of interventions and see results really quickly, particularly about the conflicts that adhere to sex. So, we think of sex as this beautiful cooperative thing, and we hope that the sex that we have is going to be like that, but it isn't always. It's often quite exploitative. It's often riven with conflicts between the mates, or even between potential mates, as well as between rivals. And so I've spent most of my career studying those conflicts, but I've always been interested in and sort of animated by questions about what it means to be alive, and what it means for humans to be alive, because evolution by natural selection is such a powerful, important concept, often misunderstood, often misused, but it can teach us so much about how things are, not necessarily how they should be, but how things are for living organisms. And so for the last decade or so, I've been spending at least half my time working on human questions about what makes human sex and reproduction and family life so complicated, interpersonally as well as ideologically.
So going back to something you just said, what do you think the greatest misunderstandings are about natural selection?
Because natural selection sort of delivers this product of, in the here and now, of apparent order, of a fit between the organism and its environment, we tend to think that it's a very smart, foresightful, forward-looking process, but it's a very darn wasteful process, really. Who gets to live, who gets to die, who reproduces, finds a mate, who doesn't. All of those things influence very, directly which genes get passed on from one generation to the next, and how common those genes become. And very slowly, iteratively, wastefully, you end up with change. That change is never, the change is not the point. It's not the point of being alive, but that change shapes the way in which animals and plants and fungi and all sorts of organisms live their lives. And so what we see now is a product of evolution, but there's a big mistake in terms of thinking about, there's a point to it or it's going somewhere. And there isn't. And it takes a little bit of getting used to assimilate that point.
And does some of that conflict between sort of mating partners play a role in that aspect of evolution?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, a mate, inherently mating is a very unselfish thing in that you're taking only half of your information, your genetic information, and combining it with half from another individual, often an unrelated, kind of almost random, not really random, but close to it. And that's inherently very cooperative, but that's often where the cooperation ends. So in a lot of insects, for example, they don't really care whether or not their mate lives beyond, those eggs being laid. Once the eggs are laid, they're unlikely to mate again with one another. And very often what an individual wants is for that to be the last time that their mate reproduces. So female praying mantises will often eat the male even before they mate, because, males are fairly common, but good juicy prey items, they're very rare. And similarly, males will often, in the process of inseminating the female, They will inflict physical damage that prevents her from remating, mating with another male using another male's sperm. And they'll also include chemicals that stimulate her to lay more eggs than she otherwise would. So, male and female have some kind of idea of how many offspring they want to have, when they want to have them, etc. But they manipulate one another into meeting their own agenda. And that's even true in humans, with a mummy and a daddy who love each other very much, can often have, relationship ending conflict over, do we have another child? When do we have another child? How often do we have sex? Those are turn out to be very, very big issues. And that's because people have different optima.
And are there trends in where those optima lie between male and female sexes?
There tend to be trends. One of the sort of dominant features that shapes those trends is that each individual offspring tends to get more investment from the mum than the dad in most species most of the time, because basically eggs are big and costly to produce, and sperm are small and you can produce millions and millions of them. And that generalizes then often into behavior in which males are sort of seekers and somewhat more expendable as parents, whereas females' contributions become compulsory. And when we think of mammals, of course, female mammals have this enormous costly business of carrying a baby to term, gestating it, growing a placenta, negotiating with the fetus for, in the case of humans, 9 months, in the case of elephants, 22 months. And so, whereas males don't have that kind of contribution. And so we see that changes the way in which males invest in reproduction, which is often very much about competing with other males in order to have access to females, because the contribution that a female makes is so valuable that it becomes like a priceless commodity, and males tend to behave that way. And you can see where this is going, of course, because with humans, if you start thinking that way, you start to fall into some fairly stereotypical ways of thinking about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a mother and a father. And of course, that story is not the only story, but it gives some shape to the basic human story of reproduction and why sex is so complicated.
Thank you. Yeah, and actually, I want to come back in a little bit to your latest book, which because I'm curious. In fact, let's just talk about it now.
Okay.
Rob has a new book out called Artificial Intimacy. Hold it up for us there. Yes, very nice. Now, what are some of the ways that the internet and media and robots and all of those things, all of those artificial technologies, what are some of the ways that they influence this relationship, or the way that we look at sort of the resources of reproduction, would you say?
Okay, big question. So I've distinguished between 3 different types of artificial intimacy. So if you think of an artificial intimacy is a technology, like an artificial intelligence, 3 different types. One is the algorithmic matchmakers. That's very straightforward. That's, Tinder and Grindr and, Christian Connection and OkCupid, that helps us to find people who might want romance or might want sex, or any other kind of service. Just micro worker platforms are also algorithmic matchmakers, as is Netflix, as is YouTube. It delivers us media that we want based on algorithms that are increasingly propelled by artificial intelligence. The next kind are digital lovers, which are machines that can produce some kind of sexual stimulation one way or another. So it might be sex robots. That's the sort of obvious glitzy example that's going around right now. But it could just be smart sex toys. There are now sex toys that are trained on, data from 30,000 orgasms or whatever it is, to deliver the best kinds of stimulation. And the next generation will probably be able to get really smarter during the time an individual owns it. They'll start to tap into the individual idiosyncrasies. And then the third type, and I think these are going to be the most pervasive and possibly the most insidious, are the virtual friends. Now, virtual friends tap into the traits that kind of made us human as we recognize what it is to be human. During the last sort of 100,000 years or so, as humans became cooperative, able to live in large cooperative societies and work together, and also be hyper-investing, loving parents, those traits are slowly being sort of exploited, or at least hacked into, by artificial intelligence. So a really simple example is the way that we make friends. You and I make friends because we catch up when we're in each other's hometowns, or maybe we text each other, or speak on social media. And we each have hundreds of people in our lives that we do that with, or do something like that with. And that's grooming. That's the equivalent of monkeys and apes, picking away at ectoparasites on one another's skin. We tend not to do that because that's, seen as kind of bad form in human relations, but we are able to talk to each other. And we're able to have about 4 times as many friends as a similar sized ape with a similar sized brain would be able to have, because we can talk and we can simultaneously groom lots of people. So that grooming sets up friend networks of sort of very close friends all the way throughout to more distant friends, to sort of somebody's that we used to know and whose name we might remember on a good day if we haven't been drinking. And the contact that we have with one another brings us closer and closer. So something like Facebook now, Facebook facilitates that grooming. It allows us to gossip with each other by posting our news, by liking it, by sharing it, by arguing with one another and commenting and affirming and all of those types of things. So it's now created this new sort of structure for grooming. And that makes it somewhere between an algorithmic matchmaker and a virtual friend. It becomes a virtual friend when Facebook itself starts making decisions about what we want to see, about who we want to see, and perhaps in the not too distant future, about, it starts generating text to groom us, to basically make us think of Facebook as a friend itself. That's probably,
Wow.
that's probably a good long introduction. So
Yeah, no. And how do you so when you were writing this book, did you attempt to tackle this from a very sort of objective scientific viewpoint, or did you find your own personal feelings? Because this is like a very, very important modern topic that affects all of our lives. And when we have kids who are teenagers, it definitely affects our lives. So how did you separate those two sides of your mind in working on this?
I think it's very difficult to do. And I wouldn't trust anybody who said that they've, just gone after the data, etc. Because, we just like the algorithms know what news we want to see, we do tend to gravitate to the kinds of things that, if not confirm our biases, at least compel us. So we'll often be changed by some information that might be just absolutely compelling when we first encounter it. I think I started out a lot more with a somewhat dark view of human relationships because of my sexual conflict work, but with a reasonably peppy view of technology. And for a long time, I was writing a book that wasn't at all about technology. And then I realized the big deal here is how this tech is going to shape us. So I was reasonably optimistic about the tech. But the more I discovered that, the technologies in just one of the things that they do can have a huge effect on us, and that is just to keep us on their platforms. Now, we mostly know the story of, going on YouTube and then finding that it's bedtime already and we've spent 6 hours scrolling through utter rubbish, or very, very well-crafted content. And that's not a mistake. There's very, very powerful machine learning algorithms that can figure out not just which videos are similar to the ones that I've watched and liked, but which videos people like me would like that we've never encountered before. So, I've recently had some Russian slap fighting delivered to me by YouTube, which was a surprise. I'm not too sure what YouTube thinks of me, but it was weird. You can't really look away from it, but you also can't really look at it because, concussion and head injury, etc. But it's weird. So every one of those platforms, particularly social media platforms, is optimized to keep us on the platform, to keep us using it, to keep us messaging our friends, so that we basically are able to see more advertisements, which is where they get their revenue from. And in doing so, it takes up some of our time. So all apes and monkeys spend about 20% of their time grooming. If they spend any longer than that, they'll starve. Humans don't need to spend as much time looking for food because we're very efficient at getting food, but we kind of have to work in order to get the money that's going to allow us to get the food. So we really can only afford to spend about 20% of our time gossiping, our waking hours. Social media users spend 16% of their waking hours on social media. So that means you've only got 4% of your waking hours left for the offline relationships that are so important. What does that mean? Well, we still spend a bit more than the 4% on the offline relationships, which cuts into sleep, and it cuts into family time, and it cuts into the kinds of relationships that we want to have with our kids. And I saw this during the pandemic, probably because I was closer to them. In fact, kids did a little bit better under the pandemic on average because they didn't have to commute. So the commuting time was sacrificed. But, you know, I've got one child in first year university, another in year 10, and two stepkids who are also in their teens. And it's just unbelievable how much their attention is captured by these things. And I would say that they'd probably say the same thing of me. And that's a huge issue. And so I'm a lot bleaker about just that mundane aspect of our future.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I know I think at some stage, everyone in my house has had an intervention with someone else in my house about social media use. Um, so, so I mean, there's obviously like when we're thinking about companies like Facebook, we're thinking, I mean, I know they come to me with a very sort of sinister, sort of capitalist, like money grabbing, don't really care about the individual sort of um, philosophy. And whether or not that's true, that's, I guess, a different topic. But what I'm curious about is the algorithms that sort of bring us content through these media, whether or not they are actually driven by sort of money making desires. Are they that different from what our friends would be doing? Like, because our friends would obviously want things for maybe different reasons, less financial, more other. But how different are these processes when you kind of look under the surface?
Well, I think that friends tend to want to learn a bit about one another's social worlds, and they want to shape our social impressions of them. So I think that there's right there is an interest that the social media companies don't have, or they don't have to the same extent. You know, we're very interested in finding out about our friends and about their worlds, but we're also interested in cultivating their view of us and establishing, you know, where do we fit in the pecking order? Where do we fit in terms of, is this person going to be a reliable ally when, you know, everything goes to hell, etc. And the companies, I think, are still very clunky at doing anything other than keeping us on their platforms. But the concern is that, you know, you and your friend get to know each other through this iterative process of interacting with each other, and you know, whatever it is that shape your personality, etc. It's very inefficient. It's still more efficient than natural selection, which we spoke about earlier, because it's not, you know, who lives, who dies, who reproduces, but it's learning, it's social learning. And you're really doing it on the basis of, you know, one friendship at a time, or possibly a few, and generalizing that to how people work. Where the social media companies are doing it differently is that they have so much data. Now, each data point is not necessarily as good as, you know, as one of your interactions with your friends, sure, but we're talking here about millions, billions of interactions, and then machine learning algorithms that aren't designed to understand. They're not there to pull out, you know, general insights about what people are and how they work. They're there to go, if you're like this, then you'll love that. If you think this, then you'll think that. And they, you know, the unbelievable computing power that's available, together with the unbelievable amounts of data, mean that it's a very, very unfair fight between the consumer and the company.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? So
It
this,
is.
like, so what sort of brought you, you mentioned that you had started another, and what you thought was probably another book before you brought in the technology more strongly. Do you want to sort of talk through the process by which you went from your sort of university academic research to the first book idea and then this one? Like, how did your mind evolve through this?
Sure. Well, so 10 years ago, I finished writing my first book, which was a series. It was kind of inspired by Freakonomics. I thought I'd try and do for evolution what Freakonomics did for economics, without the book sales, obviously. So, and so that was a bunch of things that I think, and there wasn't a huge amount of continuity between chapters, maybe 2 or 3 chapters in a row would riff on a particular subject, but it was just, this is what the world looks like to us from an evolutionary biology point of view. And when I finished that, I thought I really want to do something that's, builds a bit more of an argument. And I was, being a lot of my research being about sexual conflict, I thought, well, sexual conflict affects so many things, and it begins with the womb. It begins with this relationship between the fetus and the placenta on one hand, and the placenta is genetically the fetus. Okay, so the placenta is this organ that is, the fetus sends out to basically extract what it can from the mother, and it is a relentless agent on behalf of the fetus. And then the mum. And you go, well, surely fetus and mum have the same interests at heart. Not really, because of course, fetus doesn't want the mum to have lots more children. She wants to get everything that she can out of the mum, and doesn't really care all that much as to whether or not the mum has more babies. And
Rob,
yeah.
can I just interrupt to suggest that this would make a really excellent children's book?
Well, it goes, that same conflict goes right into night crying. So I think by the time the kids are able to learn to go through the children's books, it could be, why mummy sometimes looks at you like she doesn't like you very much. Yeah, so those conflicts are there, and then conflicts between mates, and all the way through to the fight over abortion rights, for example, and whose interests are being served by the various types of legal positions, through to sex and domestic labor and gender relations and political relations, etc. So that's what I started trying to do, but I thought that's such an important, all-encompassing, problematic set of questions that I can't possibly write to a publisher and say, look, I want you to publish this book because I don't even know what this thing is yet, which is don't do this. It's a terrible way to go about writing a book, because basically you're saying, I don't have a very good plan, but I'm going to start anyway. So I spent a lot of time on that, and I've got a lot of spin-off chapters that I am going to have to think about whether or not they should see the light of day in some other form.
Well, Rob, that tactic that you described is how most novelists would write a book, which is why no one gets an advance on a novel until it's already written.
Yeah, I must say I admire the way that you novelists go about this sort of thing, because now I'm terrified of the notion of not knowing broadly where you want to go. I suppose many do, some do. But,
yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I could ever do that.
Well, let's see. We'll see.
Yeah, fair enough. So yeah, I think, eventually I think a few agents and publishers, none of whom were the ones who ended up taking the book, had sort of steered me gently towards tech, and I realized that they were probably right. And so that was good. And that was good fun. And then about 2 years of actually writing the book.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So did you do any field research for your book?
No, not really, I must say. A lot of there are people doing things in the book from time to time, but it's not the, and then I went over there and climbed the, 482 sandstone steps and interviewed the oldest person in the world kind of thing that Malcolm Gladwell and like do so well and so compellingly and sells lots of books. And partly because the people involved, these are very touchy personal subjects. And what I wanted to do is go a step back to the big patterns and the data, probably at a cost in terms of, there's so much human interest that you could really get stuck into with this kind of topic.
Definitely. So has this book influenced your research, your academic research in evolution and mating conflict?
Yeah, very much so. So I've been interested in the incels, the involuntary celibates it was coined by a woman, the term, about anybody who's just, looking for a mate but can't really find one. But it's very much been co-opted by the angry, entitled young men who think that the world owes them some kind of pornographic harem fantasy of a life. A very small proportion of those end up savagely misogynist, and a small proportion of those end up doing very nasty things to people. But across the vast number of, desperate, entitled young men, that actually adds up to quite a lot of violence. So I've been doing my best to not be quite sympathetic, but at least to try and develop an understanding of who they are and where they come from. And my colleague at the University of Melbourne, Dr. Candice Blake, she and I have worked on, monitoring the internets, particularly the Twitters, for information about incels and where they're coming from, where they're tweeting from. And so we have quantitative data on that, and then we look at sort of local economic and cultural circumstances to get a sense of, what makes incels, and actually the thing that makes incels most predictably is economic inequality. So there's your capitalism for you. It's just, highly unequal situations tend to be situations that really amp up competition within sexes. We've already done the work with women and shown that women are far more likely to post sexy selfies under high income inequality, not gender inequality, interestingly, but among individual income within a sex, or among family income. And the same thing, incels are just much more likely to be out and about and doing their thing when there's high inequality.
Wow, that's interesting. And so do you have any feeling that within individuals, if circumstances change, if the behavior changes as well, or are they always, once you're this way, you're always this way?
Yeah, I think that the incels are a typical example of what anybody with teenagers has seen, where they think that I'm not attractive and I'm not getting all the attention and I'm not popular right now, and it'll always be that way and my life is ruined. And we have the experience of having been there at some point in the past to be able to counsel our own children or nieces and nephews and say, hey, you know what, it gets better. It always gets better, or almost always gets better. Just, stay out of trouble, try not to damage yourself, etc. And it's very much the same thing with the incels. Young men, particularly relatively poor young men, are invisible to women. So if you're a young man and you're looking for a heterosexual relationship, and this is where most of the action is here, you're going to be invisible for a period of time, where your sisters or your classmates, your female classmates, are going to be attractive and able to make good matches. You're not going to be that for a while, until you've shown some mastery of something, until you've become accomplished, and particularly until you've started to develop some kind of financial independence. And that is a very gendered view of who earns money and what you do with it, etc. But it still seems to be very much the case for most people most of the time. And so, with incels, the most important thing is just don't be obnoxious and don't get yourself a criminal record, and don't take stupid risks that end up with you injured or dying, which is what happens to a lot of young men.
Yeah. And it feels like with the kind of research that you and Candace are doing in this area that you might have some sort of recommendations you can make to, I don't know, groups that could sort of help some of these guys not mess it up when they're in this situation.
Yeah, it's you know, I've been pondering how to develop some kind of intervention or help, and of course it's quite difficult because, you know, firstly people look for affirmation, and so you'll find, you know, on the manosphere, the dark parts of the internet that are devoted to savage misogyny, these people will gravitate and sort of reinforce each other's opinions. The best you can hope for is that they'll read a Jordan Peterson book and maybe take the positive messages out of Jordan Peterson and sort themselves out a little bit. And that's not an endorsement of Peterson's books, but it's certainly a lot better than many of the alternatives.
Yeah, and something that's probably more likely to get picked up across diverse groups of men as well, as opposed
Yeah.
to like a book that's straight out feminist on the cover.
Yeah, it's just, you know, way too many steps for somebody to take. You have to be, you know, if you're a young man in that situation, to get to any kind of, you know, feminist analysis of the situation requires a series of improbable events, that's probably, so, you know, vanishingly improbable, or the ultimate open mind, in which case you're probably not one of the incels that's most at risk of actually becoming obnoxious about it.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, so, you know, and it's difficult not to sympathize with people's, you know, sadness and desperation, even if other people like them do incredibly nasty things.
yeah,
You know, there are a lot of people who still understand and have a bit of perspective on their condition and realize they just have to be patient, and that they're not
yeah,
going to have that kind of what they think is going to make them happy for now.
yeah. No, I totally get that. Like, it's, you can look at a person and say, that person's a jerk. I can see why they're a jerk, but also like that sucks that they're a jerk.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's all very complex.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I might start wrapping up our chat today, Rob. I don't want it to keep us too long, but what I'm curious about are, for the people listening or reading this chat on the website who are maybe interested in writing some science, are there some sort of interesting concepts or ideas that you think might just really sort of trigger some cool writing, some cool stories or essays? Like, what are some of the coolest things that you found in the writing of your book or in some of the research that you've done?
Wow, that's a good question. I think just about anything, any stone you turn
Mm,
over, there's something cool underneath it. Um, you know, I have all sorts of things that every day something comes across my desk that I think, wow, I'd love to write a blog post about that. So just yesterday there was one about robots that can touch, and when a robot touches you, sort of reaches out and touches your skin, you're more likely to trust what that robot has to say, and in this case has to sell you. So we know that people do very easily treat machines as if they were human, and tend to believe them and tend to trust them, and tend to disclose to them all sorts of things, the kinds of things that help you feel like you're building intimacy. And here are
is
robots.
that, can I ask, was that robot, like, did it have sort of a skin like touch
I don't
or?
think so. I don't even
Oh,
think so, you know.
interesting.
So
Interesting.
it wasn't like if you closed your eyes, you'd be being touched by a person. Now, we know that that happens. Certainly, if you know, grew up in the 70s and 80s, you know, salespeople would have touched you during the process of trying to make a sale in many cases. And we also know that, you know, that's creepy as all hell in its own way, and it can be. The pickup artists who are, you know, benefit from the incel community because they try to sell them, you know, solutions to their problem in, you know, short $20 courses and the like. They have something called kino escalation, which basically means that while you're chatting someone up, you know, touch them and touch them a little bit more and escalate that touching, and to the point where it sort of, you suddenly go, oh, well, are we having sex kind of thing, which is one of the creepiest things you could possibly hear about. And the fact that people have sort of systematized this and made an algorithm out of it, really, a human algorithm. Um, and so yeah, that's something that just happened like yesterday, that I saw robots do this thing. And here's another one of the human algorithms that artificial intimacies are learning to tap into. So I think the tech thing's really good, because what people are doing with tech and what machine learning is discovering is uncovering all sorts of stuff about human nature and human behavior. But just anything in which you follow the news and the weird things that people do, the weird things that animals do, is just inspiration. And there are so many stories out there to be told.
Absolutely. And can you tell us, because now that you mention it, I think your website might be a great place for people to go and pick up ideas. And what is your website again?
www.robbrooks.net.
Awesome. And I'll spell that out on the website as well. But no,
Thanks.
that'll be great.
Cool.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for the chat today, Rob.
Thank you, and thanks for the work you're doing with Science Right Now. It's an amazing, resource. So I'm
Yeah,
very
thank
pleased
you.
that you're doing that.
And can you hold up your book for us again?
Yeah,
Everybody
here we
needs to
go.
go out and have a look at this. And Rob, do you have a place on your website where you're posting events and things?
I am.
Yep.
I do, and I also have a Twitter, which is Brooks_Rob, which new interviews, new events, opportunities, giveaways, etc.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Cool.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Rob.
Thank you very much.
All right. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.